will start just now. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining my presentation from home. Before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the people and institutions that have supported, funded by the M.A.R.E Foundation, to whom I am deeply grateful. After completing my master's thesis on the classical period amphora from the necropolis of Kition, I decided to continue with this research topic for my PhD, receiving support from M.A.R.E and the Leventis Foundation. I would like to specifically thank the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute for the Anita Cecile O'Donovan Fellowship, through which I was able to carry out the study of the amphora from Kition Kathari that I'm presenting today. On top of that, my stay at M.A.R.E and its amazing library, which I use every day, has been essential to this research. In addition, I would like to thank the teams that excavated these sites for granting me permission to study the amphora, and particularly the Department of Antiquities and Sophocles Hadjisabas for the materials from Kathari and the necropolis of Aios Georgios, Turapi, and Aios Prodromos, and the French team at Kition for the necropolis of Pergolia. On top of that, my thanks go to all the people working at the Larnaca District Museum who have been helping me since this research started 2 years ago for my master's thesis, and of course to my supervisors, Estela and Antonio. This presentation will include materials from two completely different contexts in Kition Kathari and the necropolis of Kition, although it will focus mainly on presenting the materials from Kition Kathari, and as I was mentioning earlier, the materials were studied at two different stages, which means that the methodology used for each site is not homogeneous. The materials from the necropolis were studied first during the development of my master thesis, following a particular methodology. The aim of the thesis was to identify as many types of Phoenician amphora dated to the classical period in Kition as possible, not to completely define all the productions. The selection was therefore biased with the intention of capturing the greatest possible variability, both within and beyond the same types. It is not a quantitatively representative sample of the classical period, in which biconical amphora, or Persian jars, appear in far greater numbers than what is presented here, among other important issues. With the beginning of my doctoral research some months ago, the scope of the project has expanded both chronologically and geographically. On one hand, archaic period materials have been added to the study, and on the other, it was decided not only to examine the Kition, but also to try to systematize the role of Phoenician amphora throughout the whole island of Cyprus, with the aim of defining the connections between the Cypriot city kingdoms and the Levantine city-states, particularly from the. In this way, at Kition Kathari, the methodology for selecting pieces has been broadened, and all amphora inventoried by Karagiorgis have been examined, in addition to the stratified material from Temple 1 and Temenos-B from floor 3 to floor 2A, which had already been briefly studied by Patricia Vicari. Although this study focuses on Phoenician amphora discovered at Kition, we should keep in mind throughout the presentation that they represent only a minority compared to the rest of the material. Only 0.16% of the finds from Kition Kathari between floor 1, 3, and 2A are Phoenician amphora. Finally, before we begin, I would like to point out that the main objective of this research is to present the materials I studied during the summer, but the analysis is still preliminary and in an early developmental stage. Once these initial points have been defined, I would like to begin my presentation by introducing the historical context of Kition. As we saw last month in my colleague Jaris Norgil's presentation on the anchors from the temples of Kition Kathari, Kition was already an important harbor during the Late Bronze Age. Kition, in fact, is one of the most important sites for understanding the history of Cyprus since the Late Bronze Age, standing out for its continuous occupation from the 14th century BCE to the present day. The city of Kition lies beneath the modern city of Larnaca, in the south of Cyprus, which has resulted in fragmented knowledge of the ancient city, divided between rescue excavations of the necropolis and around the modern city, and systematic excavations at sites such as Kathari in red or Bambula in yellow. To the Cyprogeometric tree and Cyprocaic 1 and 2 periods, Kition was an important city, and focusing particularly on the Archaic period, Kition is a special case compared with the rest of the island, as there are at least three major and hotly debated questions. First, the question of Phoenician colonization, in brackets. Second, the question of the possible identification of Kition with the toponym observed in Neo-Assyrian sources, Karti-Hadasti. And finally, the question of the formation of an independent kingdom in Kition and when this might have occurred. Whatever the case, the true peak of the city would take place during the classical period, when the Cyprophoenician kings of Kition conquered Dalion and Tamasus, while also being directly involved in the international conflicts between the Achaemenid Persian Empire and Athens. In addition to this political involvement, archaeological evidence also demonstrates the importance of classical Kition, reflected in the extensive reconstructions of the sanctuaries of Kition Cathari and Kition Bambula, as well as in the construction of the famous ship sheds, which provided shelter for warships and indicate the importance of the Kition fleet. Returning to the archaic period, the main context I will examine in this presentation is the religious area of Kition Cathari, particularly Temple 1 and the Temenos B, associated to these same temples. The excavation of Kition Cathari took place between 1959 and 1983, with the volumes focused on the Iron Age published between 1999 and 2005. Some contributions, however, are earlier, such as Patricia's Decay study of the Phoenician pottery, which she wrote in 1985 and was not updated afterwards. Kition Cathari, referred to by Karagiorgis as Area 2 of the Department of Antiquities excavations, is a large religious sector that was constructed during the Late Bronze Age and housed multiple temples. According to Karagiorgis, there was a 150 years gap between the 1000 and 850 BCE, although a reassessment of the material and the stratigraphy by Smith has convincingly argued that this gap did not exist. In any case, our analysis focuses mainly on the end of the 8th to the mid-6th centuries BCE, a period in which this debate is not as important, though the end of the floor 3 is dated 20 years later in this revision, which could impact our study. The study of some types that start to be produced at the end of the 8th century, like the bullet amphora, could help to date the end of the floor 3, but the research has not reached that point yet. The excavations level that concerns us in particular are those referred to as floor 3 and floor 2A, and secondarily floor 2. In particular, the Phoenician amphora presented here appear from the end of floor 3 onwards, meaning, with a few possible exceptions, that the earliest chronology we are dealing with is the last quarter of the 8th century BCE. During this time frame, the temples in use were Temple 1, which we examine in this study, and Temples 4 and 5. The floor 3 level of Temple 1 has traditionally been interpreted as a sanctuary of Astarte, based on the discovery of a red slate bowl with an inscription mentioning this deity, dated to around 800 BCE. However, this is the only reference to the goddess in the temple, and the reading of the inscription is problematic and has been debated. Regarding floor 2A, the focus of worship seems to shift, as the Bothri associated with Temple 1, and particularly the Bothros 9, still two mention of Baal, of which one of them was found in one of the amphora from our sample, 3037, as you can see there, dated typologically at the last half of the 7th century BC. Additionally, in this level, MARE major grew in its construction over Temple 2 of the earlier phase, ending its function as an independent temple. In addition to these sacred spaces, Bothroi are common in Kition Cathari. Bothroi, also known as Pavisa, are shallow cavities or pits where votive offerings were deposited after the benches and offering tables of each temple were cleared when they had reached full capacity. It is believed that valuable objects were not deposited in the Bothroi. Amphora are, however, one of the main types of objects found in them, probably after the contents of the vessels, most likely wine, had been emptied during the performance of some sorts of religious activity, as it is the wine that gives value to these vessels. Returning to the context under study, Bothros 9 would dominate most of the space of Temenos B from the transition between floor 3 and floor 2A. As we will see later, it is one of the main contexts presented here, since a large number of amphora were deposited in it. Bothros 6A, on the other hand, was located outside these complexes next to the south wall of Temenos B, and has also been associated with Temple 1. This context is particularly interesting for understanding this amphora, as it is the only context in Kition Cathari in which the Phoenician amphora appears in high quantities compared with the rest of the material, with 63% of the finds in these Bothros being Phoenician amphora. We'll examine this context in more detail when we study them individually. Talking about the Phoenician amphora, we have to take in mind that they are a key type of pottery class in understanding seaboard trade development in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their development is related to the emergence of early globalizing economic processes in the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East during the first centuries of the Iron Age, particularly regarding the spread of wine consumption, the content that they would mainly carry. Morphologically, they are characterized by a narrow orifice, two handles, and a narrow base that varies in shape from rounded to pointed, in some cases even with a small foot. The main defining feature of this vessel is the carinated shoulder, but they are also characterized by a short neck and small handles attached to the upper part of the vessels at the shoulder carination. Regarding the content, it has been interpreted that they mostly carried wine based on residue analysis, for examples of the vessels from the Tanit, Elisa, and Philadelphia shipwrecks, which presents residue from grapes or grape-derived products. Evidence about this content also comes from the coating of the amphora with pitch, which has been found in many of these vessels and also analyzed archaeometrically. Many scholars, as you can see in the slide, have attempted to establish a typology, but a revisit to their typological study remains particularly important, however, because most types have not been defined well enough, particularly regarding the evolution of the morphology throughout time. An important exception to this is the study published in 2022 by Lehmann et al. Regarding the 8th and 7th centuries Phoenician amphora from southern Levant contexts, which define the chronology of the main types produced in those 2 centuries, mainly regarding the start and the end of the productions. It does not deal, however, with the evolution throughout time of most of these shapes, making it hard to be precise on chronology when studying them. Only in the case of the wasp-waisted amphora, the situation is different. From the 6th century onwards, our knowledge is even worse, as we don't have a clear picture yet of when some of the types start to be produced, or when some of the older types of amphora stop being produced, even if they do. Important knowledge we are missing is about the evolution of the so-called bullet amphora at the left of the slide. We have a clear understanding of when it started being produced at the late 8th century, but not about its internal development or its ending. As the most popular Phoenician amphora of the 7th and probably first half of the 6th century, it is important to define its evolution and how it continues to be produced in the late Archaic and Classical period, when the Persian jar, at the right, takes over as the main type traded. Regarding this Persian jar, we know that it starts being produced in the 6th century and that it continues in use until the end of 4th century with small variations. However, it is still very hard to date them in between this chronology. One of the most problematic productions are those dated to the 6th century BC, as not that many contexts from the Levant have been published up until now. Some important questions in this chronology are: is there a clear replacement between the ballet and the Persian productions? Is this change related to the Persian rule of the Levant? Persian volumetric standards in the amphora and the Persian amphoras seems to suggest that. Even with all these challenges in understanding Phoenician amphora production, it is still possible to propose a simplified chronological sequence throughout which these productions can be understood. Taking the essential Phoenician amphora of the 8th century are those commonly known as torpedo amphora, defined by an elongated body of around 70 centimeters, a rounded or inclined shoulder with a high elevated collar ring. Their distribution is wide across the Mediterranean, appearing throughout the Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, Cyprus, and in the early Phoenician colonies of the central and western Mediterranean. This type is closely connected with the southern Lebanese economies and possibly reflects the expansion of the Tyrian/Sidonian activities during the 8th century. Their evolution is the so-called wasp-waisted amphora, dated to the 7th century and one of the few types that can be dated with some precision, even distinguishing the different productions throughout the 7th century. These vessels are very uncommon in Kition, which is noteworthy. The characteristic amphora of the 7th century, especially its second half, are the so-called bullet amphora. Also, their production begins at the end of the 8th century and continues at least until the 5th century BC, perhaps later. Their morphology is similar to that of the torpedo amphora, but shorter, usually ranging from 30 to 60 centimeters in length. Once again, they seem to be mainly connected with the economy of Tyre and Sidon, although some productions have been associated with cities in southern Levant. The evolution of this type is defined by the reduction of shoulder and rim inclinations as we move into the classical period, features typical of all classical period amphora production. In some cases, they present twisted handles, a feature frequently used to define the Persian jars. Because of these features of the late productions, it is common that the publications confuse between them with the Persian jars when publishing only rim shirts. In the 6th century, the Persian jar began to be produced. It is one of the hallmarks of the Persian period, and it's characterized by a wide distribution throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, mainly in the Levant, but also in Egypt, Cyprus, Rhodes, southern Anatolia, and it even reaches Carthage. It is defined by a biconical body, tapering to a pointed base and a short vertical rim. The handles are often twisted and joined to the shoulders to the upper part of the body. It has been dated between the first half of the 6th century and the end of the 4th century BCE. This type has been particularly well studied through archaeometric analysis by vessels and has been linked to a provenance specifically in Sarepta, although the numbers of vessels analyzed was low. Lastly, the spindle-shaped amphora is a type that began to be produced during the Persian period. It has a widespread distribution and appears in considerable quantities in the Levant, as well in Cyprus, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia. It is mainly dated to the late classical period, although some typologies place the beginning of its productions in the 6th century BC. It is also one of the most common types in Cyprus, with a particularly important distribution also in the north of the island, but it is found all around the island. It presents a variety of shapes and sizes, most stiff or thick and convex, leading to a wide mouth with a heavy inverted rim. It may have 1 or 2 handles extending from the lower part of the shoulder to the body. The body is long and narrow, and its shapes has led some scholars to refer to this type as the spindle shape. Certain features, such as the knob-based and the U-shaped handle inclined upwards, are considered Cypriot characteristics, which, together with the fabric of some vessels, have led some scholars to propose a Cypriot production for this amphora. It is significant as this is the only amphora type for which a Cypriot production has been proposed so far. When seeking to understand the methodology behind my research, it is important to consider how the materials from Kition Khazari were processed during the original excavation. The most noteworthy finds from the successive excavations campaign were inventoried, reaching more than 5,000 objects included in the publications. However, being inventoried does not mean necessarily that the materials were fully processed. A selection of the most important pieces from each context was made, and these were subsequently drawn or photographed. In the case of the amphora, approximately 1/3 of the inventoried materials appear in the publication, either photographed in black and white or drawn or both. The rest are only described and is in many cases simply mentioned as similar to another number item, without the amphora themselves being studied in detail. For a main component of this study consists of filling this gap in our knowledge of the amphora, as a larger number of amphora with complete or close to complete profile allows us to understand the various productions and its evolution in greater detail, and it will work as a comparanda when studying the fragmented material from stratified depositions from other sites at Kition and elsewhere. Many of these inventoried amphora are particularly well preserved because they were deposited in the pottery. In addition to including all the amphora inventoried by Karagiorgis, I decided to complement this information with the study of the amphora found in the pottery trays from 2 main contexts, Temple 1 and T-B. It is important to highlight several issues that arose during my data indicate which items appear in each tray. So the initial process consisted on locating the trays containing Phoenician amphora and then studying them. The surprise came when I began examining these materials. I discovered that the publication is not accurate, as I found amphora in many more trays than those mentioned. The trays that list amphora indeed contain them, but many trays that do not list them also contain amphora. For this reason, I decided to examine all trays I could from each context and chronological phase of the Temple 1 and T-B. Another important issue to consider is that I cannot be certain that I studied all trays belonging to this context, since the location of the trays in the storerooms is, to say the least, confusing. And I have not been yet able to confirm whether all trays have been examined. At the same time, many trays stored in Terra Umbra have lost their labels, and the context is not visible on the tray themselves, where it is normally painted. Once again, bear in mind that this research is currently a work in progress. Thus, we must consider the analysis of these trays as a random sample of each context when studying the tray material. I chose to draw and photograph all typological diagnostic pieces, mainly rims, but also shoulder carinations, handles, and bases. However, for the contextual analysis, I will only use the rims, whose typology is easier to identify. As mentioned, Bikai analyzed the Phoenician pottery from the trays floor 2 up to the floor 2 in 1985, which means that we can use her statistical proposals to corroborate our interpretation of these materials. Part of her analysis focused on the Phoenician amphora, to which she dedicated 2 pages and 1 drawing plate. In it, she proposed 11 amphora types based on her knowledge of the material from Tyre and Sarepta, although current evidence, 40 years later, allows for a more precise understanding than what was possible at that time. Bikai placed particular emphasis on the torpedo amphora, including the wasp-waisted type in her definition of the torpedo types, dividing them into 6 categories: storage jar 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 1. Today, we know that 7, 6, and 3 correspond primarily to the 8th century and early 7th century productions, in green in this image, while 5, 4, and 1 mainly correspond to the 7th century productions, the so-called wasp-wasted forms, in red in the image. The only problematic category in her typology is storage yard 2, in blue, because based on the illustrations she published and the description, it mixes the productions of Bolet with those of the Persian yards, as she does not analyze them in depth. As noted earlier, these types in general have remained understudied until now. And as a result, the statistics for these materials make it difficult to understand their real significance, particularly at the end of floor 2A. On top of that, this type is the most common one in Kittion-Cathari archaic levels, with a total presence of 45.7% when considering all rims across the site, 579 out of 1,265. With this in mind, we can clearly see why it's so important to investigate these productions in depth. Considering the assemblage of amphora from Kittion-Cathari, one of the key aspects lies in the remarkable homogeneity of the production, although one would expect to observe substantial morphological variation within a sample of approximately 200 amphora, especially given the long chronological span from the 8th to the 6th and even the 5th and 4th century BCE, the recurrence of a particular ceramic fabric stands out. It is essential, however, to begin with an important disclaimer. The observation presented here derives solely from a preliminary macroscopic analysis, as no archaeometric studies have yet been carried out to confirm this. We do plan to make this analysis, but research is still in its early stages. If we focus on Kittion-Cathari, so as not to mix the different data collection methodologies, the amphora sample comprises 185 vessels, mainly dating to floor 3 and particularly floor 2A. Of these, 73 3% share the same ceramic fabric, characterized by an orange color, although color can range from dark pink to beige, and the inclusions are predominantly small to medium in size, with white and reddish ferruginous inclusions being the most common. Occasional small gray inclusions can also be observed, although this feature is not consistent across all examples. This ceramic fabric appears to share a common provenance in practice, the hinterland of Tyre and Sidon. Numerous studies have attempted to petrographically define ceramic production from this area, although its full variability is still not completely understood. Several of these work have focused specifically on amphora, and the most relevant for this study is Elizabeth Bettel's doctoral dissertation, published in 2003. Her research, centered on the Persian yards, the most widespread Phoenician amphora type of the classical period, concluded that the vast majority of the biconical amphora from the southern Levant originated from Sarepta, using the material excavated by Pichard and Anderson as a reference. As a result of this study, and owing also to the well-established ceramic reputation of Sarepta, this fabric is frequently referred to in the literature as the Sarepta fabric, when identified in Phoenician amphora outside of the Levant, as in, for example, at Tel El in Egypt or at Amathus here in Cyprus. However, the central role traditionally attributed to Sarepta has been questioned, for example, by Smith in their study of the amphora from Tel El Burak, located just 3 kilometers north of Sarepta. Their critique focuses mainly on inconsistencies in the material published by Pichard and Anderson rather than on the analytical results obtained by Bettels. Therefore, I consider Bettels' conclusions to remain valid and highly useful, particularly for the study of classical period amphora. It is nevertheless important to emphasize that distinguishing between the ceramic productions of the Tyre site and hinterland remains extremely challenging, both macroscopically and archaeometrically. The amphora produced at Tyre, recently published by Professor Paco Núñez, are very similar, making it difficult to differentiate between production from Sarepta, Tyre, and Tel Burak. Furthermore, the dataset analyzed here encompasses significant typological and chronological variability, implying that production's recipes may have changed over time or according to the intended functions of the vessels, in addition to the inherent differences that may have existed between workshops in the same region. In any case, it is crucial for this research that the great majority of Phoenician amphora found in Kittion appear to be imports from the hinterland of Tyre and Sidon, not only because of the historical conclusions that this allows us to draw, but also because it enables us to approach the assemblage from a much broader perspective. The study of this sample is, de facto, an examination of the amphora-producing ceramic tradition of the Tyre site on hinterland from the 8th to the 6th century BCE. This allows us to explore the evolution of these productions and, even if only preliminary and superficial way, to propose some ideas about certain chronological issues in the dating of some amphora and some context, although always having the best typologies up to date as the core of this analysis. Although the samples includes a large number of different types, the production technology tends to evolve in parallel, transcending boundaries among the types. Several examples illustrate this point. The evolution of the handballs from thick to small and rounded to then back to being thick and twisted, the shape of the shoulder that goes from rounded to inclined and finally to flat, or the form of the ring, whose height decreases over time. None of these indicators is fully definitive when dating these vessels, yet they allow us to contextualize certain features and better understand particular productions. A clear example demonstrating the importance of these technological developments is item 3077 in the Gideon Cathari catalog. As you can see, this piece displays a thick twisted handle, a characteristic certainly found in classical period productions and possibly already in late Archaic period with introduction of the Persian jars. The shoulder is almost flat, again another key feature for defining a later chronology, in our sample I mean. And finally, the rim also has a minimal height. All of these characteristics are typical of the classical period, or perhaps the end of the Archaic period. To make matters even more complex, in this case, we may be looking at one of the evolution of the so-called bullet amphora with a slightly carinated body, for which we have parallels dated to the 5th century BCE in the necropolis, as you can see in the right. These are very difficult to distinguish from the Persian jars without being able to observe the complete profile. Following the stratigraphy of Cathari, this amphora would originate from Bothros 9 and particularly from between the floor 3 and floor 2 technological analysis. However, as we will see next, the dating of the deepest layer of Bothros 9 is problematic, and it is possible that the materials are mixed with those from floor 2A, a phase during which this amphora may indeed have been produced. I will now present the study of all the contexts from Gideon Cathari. The amphora that can be securely dated to floor 3 are those from floors of Temple 1 and Temenos-B, as well as a single amphora from Bothros 21. At this floor, the number of Phoenician amphora I was able to locate is minimal, comprising only 12 fragments and one inventoried amphora. The inventoried amphora, 4,799, is possibly the oldest amphora in our sample. Precise dating of this amphora is difficult, especially as I was unable to examine it personally. But the published drawing suggests that it represents a production from the late 9th or 8th century BCE, likely preceding the development of torpedo amphora, which Lehmann, in his typology, classifies as the transport jar number 1. It has parallels here in Cyprus, in Salamis and Gideon Bambula. However, the rims of these types are not standardized, as they are in later types, making precise dating challenging. And in any case, it represents an exceptional instance that cannot be generalized. On the 12 fragments located in floor 3 of Temple 1 and Temenos-B, only 5 rims are fragments, of which 4 belong to the so-called torpedo amphora, specifically to the productions that BK identifies as storage jar 7, which she interprets as the earliest stage of the evolution of this torpedo amphora out of those found in Gideon. The fragment in the upper right corner is particularly striking because it has a flat shoulder. While this is a common feature in the late Archaic and Classical period, in the ballet and Persian jars, it does not appear in amphora of this chronology, and the only potential parallels would be productions from the late Bronze Age and earlier Age, classified as Pedracci 5.2. It is possible, however, that this fragment represents an inclusion from Temple 1 materials of floor 2A. As we will see, the stratified materials of Temple 1 are complex also in other periods. Temple 1 and Temenos-B were reconstructed at the end of the 8th century BCE following a major fire. The material resulting from this fire and the subsequent leveling to construct floor 2A correspond to what is referred to as between floor 2A and 3. I was unable to study the materials related to this level at Temenos-B, as I could not locate them in the storage rooms, so this analysis corresponds to materials from Temple 1 and the deepest level of Bothros 9, which dates to the moment after the fire but prior to the floor A, as the deepest level cuts through the fire level but is closed by the floor A, so this closing is problematic. 25 amphora belong to the temple one between floor 3 and 2A shafts, although only 7 of them are rims. The rims show a wide variety of torpedo subtypes, but also exhibit the typical interior groove of slightly later productions. At the same time, bullet amphora appears in these levels. With the start of their production dated to the end of the 8th century BCE, it will coincide with the dating of this level. It is also possible that some of the rims I have interpreted as torpedo amphora with the groove are actually early bullet jars. As you can see in the right, there is evidence that these rims were used in these vessels, but it's very little. Again, it is important to remember that we are dealing with an evolving ceramic tradition, and such cases are particularly valuable for understanding typological evolution. Regarding Bothros 9, it occupied the central portion of Temenos-B at this time, effectively rendering this space unusable. And that's the interpretation until now. This context has yielded the greatest number of inventoried amphora, with a total of 33, of which 24 belong to the oldest layer. However, this Bothros is, again, problematic. Karageorgis dated it to the floor 3, although Smith convincingly redates it to the transition between floor 3 and 2A, observing that this Bothros cuts through the fire layer separating the two floors. This Bothros is also problematic because the distinction between the materials deposited at this moment and those of floor 2A is unclear, making it already sealed the lower layer of Bothros 9, but also mentions the difficulty in differentiating between the lower and the upper layers. It would be particularly interesting, if possible, to clarify which objects truly belong to this context, as it represents a clearly dated face plate. These Bothros contain 4 torpedo amphora, one of which is a larger variant. It has been previously argued that these amphora were highly standardized according to Egyptian volumetric patterns, but we must consider, for example, these larger amphora, which were not included in that study. In the center and in the right of the image, you can observe the large number of bullet amphora found in this context, those with the rounded shoulders and those with the straight shoulder. The rounded shoulders is a typical feature of Phoenician amphora production in the 8th century BC and earlier, and it disappears in the 7th. It is therefore possible, at least preliminary, to propose that these vessels may belong to the earliest level of Bothros 9, although clearly dated parallels will be necessary to confirm this. The rest of the amphora, however, are particularly similar to those found in Bothros 6A, whose dating to the floor A is secure. Additionally, the presence of some types with flat shoulders and low rims, as we were talking before about amphora 3077 at the right, could suggest a dating as late as the 6th century BCE for these materials. Given the limited knowledge we currently have about this type, precise dating is difficult, and a larger sample of amphora will be needed to define the chronology of these materials more clearly. Moving on to floor 2A, most of the materials presented today belong to this level, 108 of 195. The material located at this floor level should date to the mid-6th century BC, when this sanctuary was remodeled. However, when we examine the material from Temple 1, we encounter a particular case. Of all the rim fragments located, 21, only 3 can be clearly dated to the 6th century BC, and these are unequivocally Persian jars. There are 2 bullet amphora that could be dated to this period, but also potentially to an earlier phase, as far as the 8th century BC, as we saw previously. 2 rims belong to the wasp-waisted type, dated to the late 7th century with precision. And finally, 12 torpedo amphora dominate this level. As mentioned, these amphora are primarily dated to the 8th century, but they appear very rarely in the early 7th, up to 640 BCE. Thus, the presence of this number of amphora, dated at least a century earlier than the floor, could indicate that some amphora were left in the temple until the next construction phase, or alternatively, that some amphora from the fires between floor 3 and 2A were included during the excavation. This number is not as pronounced in became published statistics, where there are 3 more bullet or Persian jars that I counted, although the torpedo amphora is still the majority in her statistics. It is also possible that the trace I could not locate contained a larger number of bullet amphora in Persian jars, which might change these pictures. We must note, however, that Phoenician amphora appearing in the floor level of the temple are extremely rare, and they only represent 0.16% of the ceramic assemblage, only 37 out of 2,000 336 shares. And therefore, these supposed inclusions are not particularly relevant for understanding the context as a whole. In T-B, we can again observe a considerable number of torpedo amphora, although the variability of rims is much greater. Considering that T-B was likely not used apart from depositing finds due to the presence of Bothros 9 and 9A, it is plausible to assume that these older vessels could have observed a higher number of bullet amphora rims, which could mark the end of use of the floor 2A for T-B. Continuing with T-B, Bothros 9 floor 2A contains only 5 amphora, of which 4 are bullet amphora and 1 corresponds to a wasp-waisted variant. We must not forget that it is possible that some of the vessels from lower floor belongs to this level. The star context in this chronology is Bothros 6A, which, as noted at the beginning of the presentation, is the only context in which the majority of materials are Phoenician amphora, representing 63% of them. On floor 2A, 361 amphora were recorded, but only 23 were cataloged, as you can see in the next slide. Of those, 348 belong to the storage jar 2 from BKI, or as I'm calling them during this presentation, either bullet or Persian amphora. Of these, only one appear to be a torpedo amphora, all the catalog material, while at least 12 are bullet jars and 8 are Persian jars. It is possible that some pieces, such as 3,297, are biconical versions of the bullet jars, which, as previously mentioned, could also be produced during this chronology. While it is impossible to describe in detail all these amphora here, it is noteworthy that none of the bullet amphora have a flat shoulders or a twisted handle, whereas 8 of the Persian jars can be securely dated to the 6th century BCE. We would expect to find at least some bullet amphora exhibiting this characteristic, especially considering the larger number of amphora located in this bottle. However, we don't know the criteria behind the selection of those 23 out of 348 amphora, and it is hard to understand whether the position of this bothroid can be concentrated in a short period of time or not. The typology of the finds suggests that this Bothros was in use from the beginning of the 7th century, as indicated by the torpedo amphora, and continued in use until the end of this level at the middle of the 6th century BCE. The huge number of either bullet or Persian jars found in this context demonstrates that most probably at some point between the second half of the 7th century and the first half of the 6th century BCE, the consumption of Phoenician wine, probably related to the Temple 1, remember, took place in number higher than at any point earlier or later around the whole Qatari complex. Until the rest of the material of Bothros 6A is restudied and the typology of these vessels improved, it will be hard to date with precision these events. At the same time, the low presence of wasp-waisted amphora, which were the most popular productions around the central decades of the 7th century, with only 2 diagnostic shares that were actually not inventoried, also suggests that the majority of the vessels deposited should be most likely dated to the second half of the 7th century or the first half of the 6th century. In the catalog, some materials from these bothros belong to floor 2A2, the transition, and other directly to floor 2. The only reference in the publication states its upper layer also contained material from floor 2, but it does not clearly define how these deposits were divided, and the published sections do not show it either. In the layer dated between floors 2A and 2, we can observe 2 Persian jars and 5 bullet amphora, none of which show characteristics indicating a later production. The materials from floor 2 are striking, and although they comprise only 3 amphora, they all belong to the type dated to the late classical period, as we mentioned before, the spindle shape. The key point is that the 2 of these productions are clearly made with clay, possibly from the hinterland of Tyre and Sidon, while the third amphora could not be examined personally, the one in the right, but shows the handle type that has been interpreted by Sagona and Hadjisabbals as a shipwreck production. Bothros 9 also has an upper layer dated to this context, containing 3 bullet amphora and 1 Sagona 8. Which we will discuss now. Introduce you to two amphora types that I have ignored, although you might have seen them in the plates of the context. First, I want to mention the amphora that I have named, only for my case, as ovoid body. There are only 4 amphora, and they have similarities both morphologically and in terms of ceramic fabrics in Qatari. They are characterized by this bag-shaped body and have a very distinctive reddish clay, well-fired and metallic. Their typology has not been well studied yet, but they appear to be a production from the southern Levant, from the south of the southern Levant, dating from the 10th century BCE to the 4th, with little typological change. Stern dates this narrow type, that you can see in the middle, to the 5th and 4th century BCE, but provides no parallel. In Kition, 2 of them were found in Bothros 6a, floor 2a, one on the problematic trace of Temple 1, floor 2a, and the last one on the deepest level of Bothros 9, floors 3 to 8. Only one of them can be clearly identified as the narrow subtype, but in this case, it should be dated the latest to the 6th century BCE. At least one parallel of the white subtype has been found in Cyprus at Salamis from the Tom 9, which is dated to the Cyprus cake 2, so in the 6th century BCE. However, at this point, I'm still lacking the knowledge to say anything else about them. In any case, if we accept the Southern Levantine provenance, these vessels demonstrate that Kitians had some, though small, interest in Southern Levantine productions, although we don't know which content they could carry. The second minor type is the type 8 of Sagona typology. To date, only Sagona has studied it superficially, and he dates it to the 6th century BCE. According to his typology, it has only been located at Asdod Jam, Azor, Kition, and Salami. And it is particularly notable for the number of amphora found at Kition, with now 17 examples. In this work, we have 2 more amphora located in the shelves of the Temple 1, floor 2a, as well as document with photographs and drawing 3 additional vessels that had until now only been described in the catalog. Morphologically, it is characterized by a convex shoulder and a squat-waisted body, with a rim that is usually straight and round or oval. Only at Kition it is possible to observe another body shape. Is cylindrical. The fabric of this type is, for studied so far, this is the only type that really has a coarse web. The color of this fabric ranges from pink to brown, and the inclusions that define it are mainly medium and large white inclusions and the small to medium black inclusions. At Qatari, it appears in the problematic lower level of Bothros 9, floor 3 to a, in the upper level of Bothros 9, floor 2, floors 2A2 of room 82, and room 24. Following the floor 2A3 to the 4th century BC in floor 2-1. If we consider that it could be an inclusion on floor 2-3 of Bothros 9, its dating should be focused from the 7th to the 4th century BC. Sagona dated it paleographically, based on an inscription on amphora from Hazor, but information about this type prior. Easily recognizable. In any case, I would like to make a of 14 pieces of this fabric, which correspond to 21.4% of the sample. These changes in the transition between floor 2A and 3 where out of 51 vessels, 37 amphora from floor 2A, we are dealing with a sample of 109 amphora, of which 85 have this fabric, increasing this number to 78%. Ultimately, this amphora seems to reinforce something already known and widely accepted in the scholarly literature, that from the end of the 8th century BCE, Kition's connection with the Levant, and presumably Tyre, became firmly established. As I mentioned in the introduction, this research began during my master's thesis, which is not the focus of today's presentation, but I will present it briefly. The necropolis of Kitions are located along the northern and western part of the ancient city and are possibly among the most studied burial grounds in Cyprus. For example, we know of excavations in the 19th century by Cesnola, the American consul in latitude of Kition and its necropolis. In 1874, Nicolau conducted a general study of the archaeology of Kition, which addressed, among other topics, the discoveries related to the necropolis up to that point. On the Bronze Age in Kition, my analysis focused on the classical period necropolis with the intention of deepening our understanding of the amphora from this chronology, studying 50 selected amphora to understand the variability of the types produced during this period. The amphora that I studied are from the necropolis of Agios Georgios, Turapi, and between the early 6th and the late 5th. On the other hand, the tombs of Agios Prodromos at the north are generally somewhat later, mainly dating to between the 5th and the 4th century BCE. Although I can find chronological differences between these two types. Regarding the ceramic fabric, 15 out of some, and this show that this clearly continued to be produced in the 5th century BCE, although some examples show almost complete flat shoulders and ring, in addition to the carinated bodies of the subtype 2-4 that you can see in the middle of the image, and we were talking about earlier. A characteristic feature of this chronology is the pivot at the base, a trait that seems to carry over to some spindle-shaped productions. It is also notable that different fabric studies aim to capture the greatest possible typological variability imported to Kition, although we have not yet fully understood these productions due to the complex context in which they have been excavated and the limited chronotypological knowledge of some in Cyprus and the knowledge of these types will be so, which will involve the analysis of Phoenician amphora from the context of Kition Bambula, particularly the temple, which shows a complete stratified sequence from the geometric period, allowing me to refine the evolution of these types, particularly from the 6th century BCE to the end of the classical period. The analysis of this amphora demonstrates that the population of Kition was interested in wine imported from the Levant. Particular types appearing in smaller number than expected are the ones wasted amphora, perhaps indicating a moment when commercial issues, however, as there are torpedo and particularly bullet amphora that could be dated to this chronology, and more research regarding it. An important topic that I have not mentioned until now is the possible local production of Phoenician amphora in Kition, iron side. Not only in terms of shapes and wears, but also in the scarcity of basket handle in Greek amphora in Kition compared to Phoenician ones, being the basket handle understood as the main Cypriot amphora production. It's possible that some of these amphora, which we have identified as imports from the hinterlands of Tyre and Sidon, might be local productions. At present, we cannot answer this question, but it is still one of the topics that we investigate in depth during the